You know, mobile devices are really interesting. Regardless of actual technical legal ownership, it's always been fascinating to me, whether it's a BlackBerry that the corporation owns or it literally is something the employee bought. People take their mobile devices very personally. They always address them, it's my phone, without regard to who actually paid for it, who actually owns it. It's always been a very personal piece of electronic equipment that people carry. And I think it really, that possession shapes a lot of folks' view. You mentioned something very interesting to me, and it's something that I've been passionate about over the years, and that's the extended enterprise. Gone are the days where the only people we worry about are those in our Active Directory. We have business partners, contractors, distributors, insurance agents, you name it. I mean, almost every industry has somebody that's kind of people that work with us but not for us. Was that something you contemplated from day one, or was that something that...
Yes, we took all of these factors together and said, this is the case for change. This is why we need to have a platform that we can accommodate these different interests in. It was very much from the beginning.
And are you still maintaining the corporate-owned program as well, or is it strictly?
Yes, the corporate-owned program focuses on the commercial people. It really came down to what phone numbers do we want to keep hold of that won't walk away to a competitor more than anything else.
Interesting, interesting. So from a regulatory perspective, you know, all of you have concerns, different ones, but concerns nonetheless about regulations that you're subject to. How did that color the construction of your BYOD policy? Jim, you want to start?
Yeah, so for us, we're actually really not tied into HIPAA data because we're, as a pharmaceutical company, we don't really have any patient information. But PII for our employees' information is really big on us. And so when we were looking to go down this road for how we could securely allow people to use their own device, our original thought was, frankly, just to use ActiveSync and let it work with the device. And the irony is, again, back in 2009, I started just, talking to our customers, our internal employees, my customer, about, what are your thoughts? What if I did some type of a program? And 2 people out of the probably 100 that I spoke with said, I said, well, if your phone is reported lost or stolen, we'll wipe all of the data off of it. And they said to me, you can't do that. And I said, sure I can. I'd use this software in the back end, ActiveSync, I'd send a command and boom, it would be gone. They're like, no, you can't do that. It's my data. And I looked at him like, you've got to be kidding me. It's reported lost or stolen. It's in the hands of a stranger. Why would you not want me to wipe that device? It's my data. You can't do that. So we went in search of something that would allow us to containerize that information so our corporate data would be here and our personal data would be there. My security engineer, Ian, went out and he found good. And it's what really allowed us to safeguard our corporate data. So you report your device lost or stolen, we'll wipe the good container. Keep your personal stuff, let the strangers have your playlist and your photos, I don't care. But that's really how we were able to separate any corporate information from everything else out in the wild. So.
Now, Sarah, in Europe especially, I mean, privacy is an entirely different topic. I mean, there's people that are concerned about it in the US, but in Europe it's more of a human right than a legal concern. How did that affect your choice of solution and your path forward?
So if it's customer-facing roles where people have iPads, they're locked down corporate iPads. So even though they can use them for personal use, there's lots of things they can't do, kind of, Facebook, kind of things. So that could, we can instantly switch those, so we know that that was safe. And obviously from a good perspective, exactly the same. It's containerized so that we can wipe it instantly. And, the European laws are very different and much tighter than a lot of the UK laws. So we just worked with the guys over there in the legal teams, but good was the thing that gave them the confidence, and because we'd used it so much longer in England and had, minimum any kinds of scares, and they went with it.
So let's talk a little bit about the construction of your policy and the folks that you work with. Presumably all of you worked with a team of people to actually come up with your eventual policy. I'm curious, being in human resources, that must have been just an interesting different viewpoint in terms of what you were doing and why. Looking back on that process now, is there anything that you would have perhaps done differently in the construction of the team or leading that team?
I don't think so with the policy per se. A thing that really surprised us, and it's interesting your comment about that personal right of having a device. You know, we deployed 10,000 iPads to our retail branch network, and we thought that people would be really excited about that. 2 months later, half of them were still in the cupboards and hadn't been opened because people were terrified of using them. So we just assumed that, you know, people would know how to use the iPads. So we had to have a completely different strategy so that our people would feel confident using that technology to then speak to customers and still be able to give a great service. So we had to completely change the way that we looked at empowering our people through that. And, you know, from a HR perspective, I could add that people, you know, side of the policy being written so that we empowered people to, you know, once we had this, you know, opportunity, that people were given the right tools to embrace it.
You know, we see this often where companies will create a BYOD program of some sort and then are surprised that they don't have the uptake that they assumed that they would have. And I think certainly, you know, part of any great BYOD program is, you know, how you market it internally. You can call it selling it, marketing it, or communicating it. Yeah. And I know some of the things that Carrie talks about are the, you know, methods by which you communicate not just the terms and conditions of the program, but literally letting people know that it's there, why they should be excited about it. I think oftentimes those of us in technology make some assumptions about, well, of course they're going to love it, of course they're going to want to do it. And often that's not always the case, especially when you're dealing with perhaps a demographic that's used to a specific device, working a specific way, and the thought of having to give that up, depending on, you know, your particular bent, could be frightening for some employees. Ravi, what was your biggest surprise in constructing your policy?
Well, we had a multidisciplinary team, legal and HR, business operations, and manufacturing. I think most of our difficulty was in working the financial model that we eventually landed on.
From a reimbursement perspective?
From a reimbursement perspective, and who actually would get company phones versus who wouldn't. So that was a very emotive topic. I think other than that, there were some minor considerations that we really should have brought up front, which is when you're opening up a BYOD program and you have dozens and dozens of sites, that means that once you've got people bringing in devices, you really should be strengthening the Wi-Fi and security and all of these that you need to provide the people who are going to bring in Wi-Fi, I mean their own devices. So that was one little learning that we had. And the other was with helping people, meeting them halfway in terms of security by saying, okay, we'll let you use a simpler pin with a longer timeout so that you can be in a meeting and not have to constantly log in. But at the same time, we're going to reduce the number of tries you have before we kill it. Oh. So, I mean, these were the kinds of things, and really a communications and a change management and training program. These were the things that we should have emphasized even more than we did, and so that was a good learning.
We'll often see when a company turns on a BYOD program, the other side effect is that, as I'm sure most of you in the audience have multiple mobile devices. If there's no limits, if you're simply telling employees, tomorrow bring in your devices and it's a free-for-all, you know, from an IT perspective, from an infrastructure perspective, it can be overwhelming. You know, all of a sudden you can literally have a 300% increase in the number of endpoints that are on your network that you're needing to deal with, and it's often not intuitive. I'm curious, Jim, did you have any?
Well, we actually, this came about a year after we deployed the project. We moved into a new office building in one of our facilities in New Jersey, and we found out that the cellular connection in this building was horrible. People could be walking around the floor, then they'd drop cell service. So we had to spend a little bit of money to, beef up our internal Wi-Fi and then allow everyone access to an internal guest network. And at the same time, we worked with our carriers and one of our vendors to basically bring in cellular repeaters so that their devices would actually work. And that came at a little bit of a cost. It actually turned out not to be as expensive as we thought it would be. But that was something that, you know, we never saw that one coming, quite frankly, when we moved into this new facility. Just assumed brand new building, you know, nice part of town, that we'd have good coverage in there. So
Have any of you dropped desk phones as a result of having?
we contemplated it. In fact, when we expanded India to another office building, where we seriously took a look at, should we just provide the smartphone as their only phone? And we actually backed off on it. This was maybe 2 years ago. And the real issue around it was we had a little bit of grumbling about people saying that they were using too much of their voice plan on their phone, and they didn't, this is before pretty much, unlimited everything. But there's too much grumbling about it. We thought if we did that, we might have to increase the stipend to give them more money, which I absolutely didn't want to do.
YouTube wasn't taking up the bandwidth, it was the business data. So we have a few minutes left, and I think it would be useful to have everyone, Carrie, you as well, given your experience here. I'd love it if each of you would think about your particular BYOD program, and looking back on it, what's something we can offer our audience that was perhaps something you learned during that process, or was a surprise, or can you help our audience members perhaps avoid a pothole that you stepped in? Sarah?
For us, it would be involve HR. Right from the beginning, they shouldn't be blockers. They should be there supporting the program and just giving the people element and looking at all the positives that you can achieve by having much more mobility and flexibility for your workforce.
HR involvement. Jim?
For us, it was really our privacy function, which when we developed our program didn't exist. So if you have a privacy function, please involve them now. But after the fact, they got involved and wanted to say in what we were doing, and it's been a painful past several months as we worked through them with, to be blunt, a silly little disclaimer when they install the application. So.
Okay. Privacy. Robbie?
Yeah, and for us, it was a lot of legal, regulatory, and privacy kinds of considerations, particularly in Europe. There were broader considerations such as, if someone has their own personal device, is that discoverable or not? So there are other legal questions around it. But especially in Europe, especially in Germany, and getting things through the work councils, we're still working on it. So that has been a serious challenge.
I've heard that one before, e-discovery. For those of you who are subject to that or see that, definitely something to contemplate early on. Carrie, with all the customers you work with
all of the, I'd like actually to address the e-discovery question.
Please.
Because I get that question very often. And something that we have found is rather than setting up in your policy or your other communications that the employer has the right to confiscate or to impound the device, is to appeal to your employees and your users' sense of corporate citizenship. Work with your attorneys to soften that language a bit and say the employee will voluntarily surrender the device because we all, and I've told our general counsel this, if he needed my smartphone to defend good, and it was needed for a deposition, even though I think the chances of that are, very remote, I'd be happy to give him my cell phone. Now, my smartphone. What I need in exchange, though, is I either need a loaner device or I need a new I need a new smartphone, right, to replace not only for the business use that I use my smartphone for, but for the personal use. So we have found it to be a successful strategy for e-discovery to say, sure, I will cheerfully involuntarily surrender my device. So it makes it an act of good citizenship. And if you need it for more than a day or two, you need to buy me a new phone. And that makes everyone square, because again, the policy is really, it's a balancing act of competing interests. But I think overall, John, my suggestion would be to make sure you engage these teams outside IT early, get them involved with your pilot, make sure they understand the technology, because as you mentioned before, we assume it's obvious. And it isn't to the folks who don't live in it every day. Make sure they understand the container, get them involved, communicate early and often, invite them to join you, invite their opinions, because you can, and their advice. They're doing their jobs, and they're trying to protect risk. They're trying to mitigate risks. There's a solution for all of those that you can negotiate to. And that builds consensus and buy-in across the organization that also helps with the adoption and the rollout efforts.
Well said, well said. Well, I want to thank our panelists, Sarah, Jim, Ravi, Carrie. Thank you so much. We'll be around afterward to answer additional questions if you'd like, but thank you very much.
Okay.